Long time no see. So the reason why I haven't recorded any videos in a couple weeks, or 2 or 3 weeks now by this point, is because I went to Russia. Went to Russia for 9 or 10 days. I'd never been there before, and there were several different reasons to go, but mainly it was to see the art and the culture of the place. They have one of the finest museums on planet Earth in St. Petersburg, Russia, which is the only city I went to. And you can argue about this, and I certainly have, but St. Petersburg is the cultural center of Russia. Uh, Now, that is a weird thing because it's also really not historically part of the Russian world. St. Petersburg was created out of nothing. It was created like Washington, D.C. It was created out of a swamp where not too many people lived by a ruler, Peter the Great, who wanted to get out of Moscow because he didn't want to have to deal with the power structure that was already there. He wanted to create it from scratch. And if you're interested in the um, uh, evil Masonic origins of St. Petersburg as a religious and cultural center, as a break with the past, go look up Matthew Raphael Johnson because he's got a lot of interesting material on that. Now, it is the imperial capital. St. Petersburg was the center of the Russian government from 1703 until 1917, when the Bolsheviks took over Russia, and then they had the same problem as Peter the Great. They needed to move their government to a place where there wasn't already an established power structure, so they went back to Moscow, which is the historical capital of the center of the Russian nation, the Russian people, Russianism, Rus. So, what I've got a picture of here, well, let's start at the top and work down. We've got a quote from Hillary Clinton at the top. She's talking about Vladimir Putin in this quote, and she's saying Vladimir Putin is like Hitler. Uh, she gives a quote from Hitler, or she says that what Hitler was doing was trying to go and protect Germans outside of Germany, and that Putin is basically Hitler because Putin said that he's going to go protect Russians outside of Russia. In both cases, that's nationalism, and that's why I think that Putin is a nationalist, because he's going to protect his people wherever they happen to be. It's the opposite of the West, which says that they're not even going to protect their people in their own countries, much less overseas. They might actually protect you overseas better than they would in your own country. They'll probably just brutalize you in your own country if you're a citizen of a Western country. But I thought that would be good because that's kind of like a good way to sum up what Western political leaders think about Russia and think about Putin. They say that he's Hitler, and he's Hitler because he's a nationalist. I'm a nationalist, and I don't really see too much of a problem with Putin. I certainly see much less of a problem with him than I do with the people who are supposed to be representing me and the other people who look like me and sound like me and all that good stuff. So I thought we'd start off with that quote. Down below at the bottom of the screen, you can see the tricolor of the Russian flag, along with the double-headed eagle, which is, I think it's the royal crest for the Russian autocracy. Those two things are good good ways to split up the two different trends in Russian history. The double-headed eagle is a symbol that was used prior to Russia. It was used in Byzantium as a symbol of empire, basically, and it goes all the way back to Rome. Um, I saw a lot of those in Russia on tops of buildings and different things, and to me it just looked like Roman imperial standards, but it's adapted because it's got two heads, and I think the Romans for the most part just used one. This symbol is on top of the Russian flag, which looks like any other European or modern flag, because it is. Peter the Great adopted that from the flag of the Netherlands. Peter the Great wasn't really fond of Russian culture itself. He grew up in Russia, hanging around with a lot of Europeans who were living in Russia. And when he got to be old enough and took the throne, He left Russia and went basically on a European tour and experienced Europe. When he got back from his European tour and had been initiated as a Mason, of course, Freemasonry, he then imported lots of Western and Central Europeans into Petersburg. So the city that I went to today is populated by Russian speakers and Russians, ethnic Russians, but 300 years ago, or 250 years ago, or even 200 years ago, a lot of the people in St. Petersburg would not have been ethnic Russians, they would have been Europeans. They would have been French, Germans, Scandinavians, English, all the different peoples of Western, Central, and Northern Europe. But today the Russians have taken it over, and it was a long, difficult struggle for that demographic replacement to take place that probably nobody wanted. But in the wake of the Russian Revolution, that old version of Petersburg is gone. So you have the architecture and the structure of the old European-style city, but today it's all full of ethnic Russians. So that's basically my introduction here. I'm going to go through some slides. This is like old, movies, old, slides, like you're going to go sit down with your aunt. She's going to show you a bunch of pictures of her trip, and you're just bored to tears, but you have to do it anyway. So if you want to jump out, jump out. But this is a picture of a statue of Lenin. So after getting off the plane, you got to take a 20-minute bus ride to get to the middle of town, and then you get on the subway and you take that to the historic district where all the old stuff is. But you've got to walk through this park, and there is an enormous statue of Lenin there. It's probably 30 feet tall, made of bronze. So this was a question for me going there. It's like, how many pieces of Soviet art am I going to see? Stuff that glorifies the Soviet era, that memorializes it. Now, not too far away from that big statue of Lenin, there's a war memorial, World War II war memorial that commemorates a bunch of Soviet soldiers from World War II. So that's not too surprising because, we always like our soldiers, except in America, for example, the soldiers who died in the Civil War fighting on the southern side, we have to go take all of their fucking statues down now, of course, right? Well, in Russia, they still commemorate their dead regardless of, whether the ideology they were behind was right or wrong. So maybe we can learn a little something from that. But that, I didn't get a picture of that, but the World War II memorial was really amazing. The Lenin one should go, though, in my opinion. This is me standing outside a church called Spas na Krvi. It means the Savior, Church of the Savior on the Spilled Blood. This church was built because some socialist, anarchist, terrorists blew up one of the Russian czars on this spot. So they built an enormous, beautiful church on the spot where he was blown up. He didn't actually die there. They got him home before he expired. But they built this beautiful church there. Now, they completed it right before the Russian Revolution. So the church, I don't think, was ever actually used by the public. It was almost finished, or it was just finished before everything fell apart. Now, after the Russian Revolution, the ruling regime didn't really have a need for large Orthodox cathedrals. They didn't have a need for them because most of the Bolsheviks were Jewish, atheists, or otherwise not interested in an expression of the Russian ethnic soul, character, which would be orthodoxy and, Russianism, Great Russians. So they didn't really have a use for these kind of structures. So what they did was they used this church to store vegetables, and it basically just sat derelict, and it was vandalized, and some of the stuff inside was stolen and all that. In 1941, the Germans they had Leningrad, or Petrograd as it was called, whichever, St. Petersburg, they had it under siege, and they dropped a bomb through the roof. Now, probably because of some holy spiritual mystic power was present, The bomb didn't go off, so it sat on the floor for the next 20 years. And finally, in 1961, the Soviet government sent some people in there to remove the undetonated ordnance and begin restoring the church. So this is kind of an interesting case study to look at Russian history. At the very beginning in 1917, and particularly from 1921 to 1928, the Soviet government was extremely anti-Orthodox and anti-Russian and anti-Ukrainian, of course, later on in the 30s. But it wasn't a nation at war with itself. It was a ruling class at war with the other 90% of the people who lived in the country. So they destroyed some really nice churches, and they kept some other ones from being used when people would have gladly wanted to use them. But after Stalin purged most, not all, but most of the Jewish leadership of the Bolshevik Party in the 1930s, and after Stalin himself died in 1953, most of the people who were in charge in the Soviet Union were now Russians and Ukrainians. So they did not have the personal animus against the Russian nation and its religious expression, which is Orthodoxy. So from 1953 onward, you start to see the Soviet government begin to take care of its old churches and old structures, and they would actually pay for them to be restored. So this particular structure was restored, I guess, beginning in 1961 all the way up until now. And if you go in, it's got mosaics, floor to ceiling. It is absolutely beautiful. It's one of the greatest churches on planet Earth for sure, but really, really nice on the inside. I didn't take any pictures because some things are just, like, you don't really want to be like a tourist in there snapping hundreds of photos in some places, and this was one of them, but it's beautiful. This is me standing in front of a sculpture of Alexander Pushkin. I think this is the Russian State Museum. This is like their back. I think this is the back side of that museum. I could be wrong, but that's Alexander Pushkin. His great-grandfather was an African slave who was abducted by Muslim slave traders from Africa, sold to Turks, and then bought from the Turks by Russians. So his great-grandfather was a curiosity, or a token black, who was bought by Peter the Great in order to adorn his court. And so, they gave him a white woman, and he had a bunch of kids, and one of those great-grandchildren ended up being Pushkin, who I think is celebrated as the #1 Russian language poet of all time. Haven't read much Pushkin. I read one poem by him, and it was very nice. But he's got the sideburns, of course, he's famous for, which I sympathize with because that's part of my style too, or at least it was before I went full, whatever. This is St. Isaac's Cathedral, I believe. Let me double check that. I don't want to lie to you. I'm sorry, this is the Kazan Cathedral. This is the Kazan Cathedral. So it looks like St. Peter's Basilica. It's got this big horseshoe pattern because, if you're going to be the third Rome, which is how the Russian imperial project thought of itself, you got Rome, then you got Byzantium, then you've got Petersburg, basically, right? It's the third Rome. It's got to have a St. Peter's Basilica. So that's why they built it like that, and that's a very nice structure too. We were walking past that at night, and I think we saw some Chechens who had just had a wedding party. They were out there dancing and getting wasted. They had a really shitty limousine that they had rented, and they were really cranking some really trashy Euro, techno garbage, but they were having a good time. Hey, they were getting married. I can't complain about that. This is me in the Russian State Museum looking at one of the most famous paintings by one of the most famous Russian painters ever. His name is Ilya Repin, and this is the reply of the Cossacks something like that is the title. But you can see how big these paintings are. I don't know what it was about the Russian autocracy with the House Romanov, but man, they paid for some really big paintings. Bigger paintings than I think you would ever see in the West. Paintings that are just so big they don't need to be big. But Repin, on the other hand, he's actually really good. So you could look at this painting all day. There's so much going on there. Look it up on Wikipedia or whatever. It's called The Reply of the Cossacks. It's just great. But all his stuff is good. Man, I was talking about big paintings, and this one's twice as big as the last one. This is called The Last Day at Pompeii, something like that. And I think this is by Karl Brulov, who came, I think, from a family of architects. So anyhow, he's one of these ethnic Germans that they bring into Petersburg, and then they do paintings, they do architecture, they do all this high culture. And we got to do it big. The room that this is in the State Museum could hold like 10 of these paintings. That's how big this room is. And then the ceiling is, of course, glass, so it's got natural light coming in. And then these palaces, which today are museums, they would have 20 of these rooms. It's just amazing. Okay, this is me on the bridge over the River Neva. We're looking at the Petropavlovskaya Krepust, which is the Peter and Paul Fortress. This is a big star fort made out of masonry on a little island in the Neva, which is the big river that goes through Petersburg. And originally, I think they started building this to have basically a citadel. This is where the military and everybody could go if there was an invasion of Petersburg from Scandinavia or something like that. And the original church and the crypt, the royal crypt, is all in this structure. One of my favorite things that I saw there was the Trubetskoy Bastion, which was the political prison of Russia for about 80 years or something like that. And all of your famous anarchist, socialist, leftist terrorists were held in there. So Lenin's brother was held in there, and it was a detention facility, not a punishment facility. So they were only held there while they were going to court. Trotsky, or rather Bronstein, aka Trotsky, was in there, and I was very gratified to see that they actually had his birth name in parentheses. So it does actually say Bronstein. But they've got the prison set up just like it was in the 1880s, so that you can see how they lived. And the thing that surprised me was that their cells were actually very large. So they didn't have it too bad, considering that most of them were bloodthirsty terrorists who were mostly in jail for either having killed someone or trying to kill someone through bombings and shit like that. So that was a lot of fun. I'd recommend that. The church there, that's where all the Romanovs are buried, all the ones that they have, I think, all the ones who were either czars, empresses, or their immediate children. So I think there's probably about, I don't know, maybe 60 or 70 people buried there all together. The last family, Nicholas II and his family, they're all buried in a special room. They were canonized, I think, and buried there in the early 2000s. Can't really talk about that too much, or I'll start crying. I'm a sensitive person, and some, it may not seem like it, but some things I really get worked up about, and anyhow, that's one of them. So I was in the church there, walking around, probably crying, when just a second. There was a street artist, and he was doing this street artist thing where you look for a sucker, which I am, and then you draw a picture of them, and then you tell them, that they can buy it if they'd like. And what are they going to do? People don't go around drawing your picture all the time, right? So, this artist in there, let me get you the profile. Yeah. So, this guy was drawing my picture in there while I was crying, and you can see the eyes. I mean, he dressed it up a little bit, right? But how much do you think this cost? This guy charged me like $9 for this. I mean, come on. I had to buy it. I was going to buy it anyway, probably whatever it cost, right? So anyhow, that was fun. That was a good keepsake. So I would definitely recommend to go to that facility. I was only there for probably, I don't know, like 2 hours. There's all kinds of stuff there, but seeing the crypt and the church there and the Trubetskoy, the prison, that was really good stuff. This is a picture of me with a statue of Peter the Great that I think Catherine II, which would have been his granddaughter-in-law, I think granddaughter-in-law. So she paid to have this this bronze horseman, which is what it's known as, done by this Italian artist. I can't remember his name. This stone that he's on, look, it's like some kind of sandstone or whatever, but they drug that, a few hundred miles, and it's one of the biggest single pieces of stone that has been moved after Roman times, because the Romans and the Greeks, of course, even though they didn't have smartphones or gender theory or whatever the hell we've got today, they managed to move some stones that are bigger than basically anything that we were interested in doing today. But that aside, this is one of the biggest rocks around, and they moved it to Petersburg to put this bronze horseman on top of, and it's pretty cool too. Peter's kind of a sketchy guy who may have been demon possessed, but the statue is cool. Art's cool and everything. The guy, I don't know, but okay. So I think I got my slides out of order. Hold on a second. Nope. Okay. Let me get back to where I was. Okay. So after I leave Petersburg, then we go to London, because we're flying back to America, and we've got about a day for a layover. So we get to London, and the biggest shock, which I think we kind of knew we were going to deal with, is going from the east, so-called East Russia, back to the west. In Petersburg, basically everybody was white, if you consider Russians to be white, which I do. And there were a lot of people in Petersburg who were, teenagers, who were heterosexual, who were going on dates, who were holding hands. Well, when you get to London, it's a different story. You're basically bombarded with all types of Africans, Arabs, basically everything but white people, and then probably half of the white people that you run into are from the Balkans or from some other part of Europe. They're not from Britain in any way, shape, or form. None of these peoples are. Whereas in Petersburg, it's like lots and lots and lots of Russians. That's the dominant type of person. And even in the historical districts of Petersburg, when you're in the historical district in London, you've got some gigantic Caribbean black guy trying to sell you skunk weed, which happened to me, and we'll get to that in a minute. But so what I took a picture of here was a memorial that I thought summed up the British Imperial Project pretty well. This was a memorial that I found in London that talked about how 2 million or 3 million people from the Empire served in the British Army during the First and Second World War. 2 or 3 million people. That's a lot, and these are just volunteers. These aren't even conscripts. So that's basically the British project.